March 3, 2009. Marcus Churchill stood in Elmwood Cemetery at 2 a.m., staring down at his daughter's empty grave. The headstone was there. The flowers he'd brought every month for 15 years were there. But 6 feet down, where Keisha's body should have been, there was nothing but disturbed earth and a cell phone. It rang once. The voice on the other end was older now, deeper, but he'd know it anywhere. "Hello, Daddy." 3 words that shattered everything Marcus thought he knew about loss, about guilt, about the night that destroyed his life. The Black Mafia hadn't killed his daughter. They'd taken her, raised her, turned her into something he never imagined. And now, she was coming home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone slipped from Marcus's trembling fingers, landing with a dull thud on the torn earth. His knees buckled, and he caught himself against Keisha's headstone, the lie carved in granite that had anchored his grief for 15 years. Beloved daughter, gone too soon. The words blurred as his vision swam. Somewhere in the darkness between the cemetery's ancient oaks, a car engine purred to life. Headlights swept across the desecrated grave, illuminating the chaos of displaced soil and withered flowers. Marcus dove behind the headstone as bullets chewed through the marble angel that had watched over his monthly visits. The muzzle flash strobed like lightning. 3 shots, 4. The distinctive crack of A45, the same sound that had haunted his dreams since that night in Detroit when he'd held what he thought was his dying daughter in his arms. Except she hadn't been dying. She'd been disappearing. Marcus rolled left, his service weapon appearing in his hand with muscle memory that 15 years of running a quiet security firm hadn't erased. The shooters were moving, boots crunching through dead leaves. 2 sets, maybe 3. Professional spacing, coordinated suppression fire. This wasn't some random cemetery vandalism gone wrong. They'd been waiting for him to find the grave, waiting for him to answer that phone. "Daddy still got good reflexes," a voice called out from the darkness. Female, young, but not Keisha's voice. This one carried a hard Memphis accent and the casual cruelty of someone who'd grown up in the life. "Dre said you might. Said you were dirty Detroit PD before you went soft down here." Dre. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. Andre Dre Williams had been nothing but muscle back when Marcus was feeding information to the Castellanos family in Detroit. If Dre was running operations now, it meant the old guard was gone and something hungrier had taken its place. "Where is she?" Marcus shouted into the night, his voice cracking on words he'd thought he'd never say again. Laughter echoed between the tombstones. "Which she you talking about, old man? The dead one you've been crying over all these years, or the live one who's been learning the family business?" Another burst of gunfire forced Marcus deeper behind cover. The ancient headstone was taking a beating, chunks of carved marble exploding with each impact. He counted muzzle flashes, 3 shooters, moving in a classic pincer formation. They had him surrounded, but they weren't trying to kill him. Not yet. This was about delivering a message. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. "Package should have reached your office by now," the female voice called out. Keisha's bracelet, the one with the little dolphins she loved so much, took it right off her wrist when we pulled her out of that coffin. Well, pulled out what was left after 15 years of you visiting an empty box. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering. The bracelet had been a birthday gift, Keisha's 13th. She'd worn it every day until the night she'd supposedly died. He'd buried it with her, along with her favorite stuffed animal and a letter he'd never let himself read again. "What do you want?" His voice carried across the cemetery like a confession. Smart man. Always liked that about dirty cops. Y'all know how to cut to the chase. Footsteps moved closer, just beyond the reach of the security lights. "There's a file in the FBI's Memphis cold case vault. Case number 2007 MC 4419. We know you still got connections from your police days. We know you've done security work for federal facilities. Most importantly, we know you'll do whatever it takes to keep your family safe. My family's dead. See, that's where you're wrong, Daddy." The voice was different now, closer. And for one heart-stopping moment, Marcus thought he heard something familiar in it. an echo of the little girl who used to fall asleep in his lap during late-night movies, who used to braid flowers into chains on lazy Sunday afternoons, who used to call him her hero. Keisha's alive, Marcus, has been this whole time. But whether she stays that way depends on how well you follow instructions. A photograph landed in the dirt beside his feet. Even in the dim light, he could make out the image. A woman in her late 20s, unmistakably his daughter's face but harder now, marked by years he'd never shared with her. She was standing in what looked like a warehouse, holding today's newspaper. 72 hours, the voice continued. Get us that file, or the next grave you visit will be real. The car engine started up again, but this time they were driving away, leaving Marcus alone with the empty grave and the impossible truth that had just torn his world apart for the second time. His daughter was alive, had always been alive, and now the Black Mafia was giving him the chance to lose her all over again. Marcus remained crouched behind the shattered headstone long after the engine sounds faded into Memphis night. His fingers traced the photograph's edges, proof of life that felt like a death sentence. The cemetery's silence pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Union Avenue and the whisper of October wind through dying leaves. 15 years of grief, 15 years of visiting an empty grave, talking to marble and bone that had never held his daughter. The revelation should have brought joy, Keisha was alive, but instead it carved a deeper wound. Every birthday he'd missed, every Christmas morning he'd spent drunk and alone, every milestone that had passed while she lived and breathed somewhere beyond his reach. He studied the photograph again under the amber glow of a security light. The woman in the image had Keisha's eyes, dark brown flecked with gold, but everything else spoke of survival's harsh education. Her posture was guarded, shoulders set with the careful tension of someone who'd learned not to trust sanctuary, even holding a newspaper for proof of life. She looked ready to fight or flee. The bracelet. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his office voicemail, knowing he'd find what they promised. His own voice greeted him, professional and measured. Churchill Security Solutions. Leave a message. After the beep, he punched in his code. You have one new message. Received today at 8:47 p.m. The timestamp matched perfectly with his cemetery visit. They'd been watching him for weeks, maybe months, learning his routines, his vulnerabilities. The 23rd of every month, like clockwork, he drove the 30 minutes from his downtown Memphis office to Elmwood Cemetery, always alone, always carrying the same white chrysanthemums Keisha had loved. But tonight, no flowers. Tonight, just the terrible arithmetic of ransom and resurrection. Marcus stood slowly, his knees protesting. 58 felt ancient in moments like this, when the past reached through time to reclaim him. His body carried the accumulated weight of 2 decades in law enforcement and 15 years of careful, quiet exile. Memphis had been supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where former Detroit Lieutenant Marcus Churchill could disappear into the modest respectability of private security work. He'd built a small life here. Churchill Security Solutions occupied a narrow office on South Main Street, squeezed between a vintage clothing shop and a blues memorabilia store. His clientele was carefully chosen, small businesses needing security assessments, wealthy midtown families wanting discreet background checks on nannies and contractors. Nothing that would attract federal attention, nothing that would remind him of the choices that had cost him everything. The work paid for a tidy apartment in Cooper Young, walking distance from restaurants where the waitresses knew his order and bartenders let him nurse bourbon in comfortable silence. He'd cultivated the persona of a widowed retiree, tragic but unremarkable, a man who'd lost his family to Detroit's violence and sought peace in Memphis's slower rhythms. But peace was always temporary for men who'd made the deals Marcus had made. The drive back to his apartment took him through the heart of Memphis's gentrified core. Even at midnight, the city hummed with muted energy. Tourists stumbling between Beale Street blues clubs, late shift workers heading home from downtown hotels, college kids from roads spilling out of Cooper Young bars. Normal people living normal lives, insulated from the shadow economy that had swallowed his daughter whole. Marcus parked in his designated spot and climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment. The space reflected his emotional geography, Clean, minimal, temporary. A couch and television for the evenings when sleep wouldn't come. A kitchen table where he ate takeout and reviewed security proposals. Bookshelves lined with police procedurals and Memphis history. Subjects safe enough to occupy his mind without stirring dangerous memories. The only personal touch was a framed photograph on the mantel. Keisha at age 12, grinning gap-toothed after losing a baseball game. She wore her Little League uniform with grass stains on the knees and dirt under her fingernails. Before everything went wrong. Before Marcus's compromises caught up with them both. He set the new photograph beside the old one. Same eyes, different worlds. The child's innocent joy replaced by an adult's careful wariness. What had they done to her? How had they shaped his daughter into someone who could work within their organization? The questions multiplied like cancer, each one metastasizing into darker possibilities. Marcus poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his reading chair, studying both images in the lamplight. Outside, Memphis settled into its midnight quiet. In 71 hours and 43 minutes, he would either hold his daughter again or watch the Black Mafia kill her for real this time. The bourbon burned going down, but it couldn't touch the cold certainty spreading through his chest. They'd chosen their leverage carefully. After 15 years of believing he had nothing left to lose, Marcus discovered he'd been wrong. He still had everything to lose. He'd just forgotten it was still alive to be taken. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m., shattering the fragile peace Marcus had found staring at the 2 photographs. He'd been dozing in his chair, the bourbon glass balanced precariously on his chest, when the shrill sound cut through his apartment like a blade. He knew before answering that this call would change everything again. Marcus Churchill. His voice came out steady despite the tremor in his hands. You always were a light sleeper. The voice belonged to someone he'd tried to forget for 15 years. Detective Ray Castellanos. No relation to the crime family, just an unfortunate coincidence that had made internal affairs suspicious when the investigations began. Ray had been Marcus's partner during his last 2 years with Detroit PD, the only cop who'd gotten close to discovering Marcus's arrangement with the Black Mafia. Ray. Marcus sat up straighter, bourbon fog evaporating. It's been a long time. Not long enough, apparently. Ray's voice carried the weight of years and disappointment. Got an interesting call tonight from someone claiming to represent your old friends. They wanted me to deliver a message. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. Marcus had chosen Memphis partly because it was far from Detroit's reach, far from anyone who knew about his compromises. But geography meant nothing to people with long memories and longer grudges. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the shit, Marcus. We both know what you were doing those last few months before you disappeared. The only question was whether we could prove it. Ray's breathing was heavier than Marcus remembered, the sound of a man who'd aged hard in the intervening years. I spent 3 years trying to build a case against you. 3 years of following paper trails and connecting dots that always led to dead ends. You were good at covering your tracks. Marcus said nothing. The photographs on his mantel seemed to watch him. 2 versions of his daughter separated by 15 years of lies. Then your daughter got killed, Ray continued, and you vanished south like smoke. Case went cold. I figured grief and guilt would be punishment enough for whatever you'd done. Where is this going, Ray? The message I'm supposed to deliver? It's about a file. FBI Cold Case Vault, Memphis Field Office. Case number 2007 MC 4419. Ring any bells? The numbers hit Marcus like physical blows. 2007, the year he'd fled Detroit. MC, Memphis, criminal, 4419. He'd memorized that case number during his first month in Tennessee, when paranoia had driven him to research every federal investigation that might threaten his new life. It was his own file, his own case. They told me to remind you about Detective Angela Torres, Ray said. Said you'd remember her real good. The bourbon glass slipped from Marcus's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Angela Torres, the internal affairs investigator who'd gotten too close to the truth about Marcus's arrangement with the Black Mafia. The one who'd disappeared 2 weeks before she was supposed to testify before the federal grand jury investigating police corruption. The one Marcus had sold to save his own skin. They never found her body, Ray continued, his voice flat with old disgust. But they found her car in the Detroit River, found her blood in the trunk, found evidence that someone had tipped off the very people she was investigating. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering. Angela Torres had been young, idealistic, convinced she could clean up Detroit PD from the inside. She'd been building a case against 3 detectives, including Marcus, for feeding information to organized crime. She'd been thorough, relentless, and ultimately naive about how far compromised cops would go to protect themselves. "The FBI never closed that case," Ray said. "They just moved it to Memphis when they realized you'd landed there, kept building the file, waiting for enough evidence to make charges stick. 15 years of surveillance reports, financial records, witness statements. Everything they'd need to put you away forever. What do they want, Ray? Same thing you wanted back in Detroit. Insurance. That file disappears and everyone's happy. It stays where it is, and your daughter dies for real this time." Ray paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been sympathy. "They sent me a photo, Marcus. She looks just like her mother." The connection ended, leaving Marcus alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. He'd thought the Black Mafia wanted him to steal evidence about their operations. Instead, they wanted him to erase the proof of his own betrayals. The file that would send him to federal prison also contained enough information to expose their current operations. Witness statements, surveillance records, financial transactions that connected Detroit's past to Memphis's present. They weren't just holding his daughter hostage. They were offering him a deal: destroy the evidence that could condemn them both, and everyone walks away clean. Marcus stared at the photographs on his mantle, understanding finally that his past had never really let him go. It had simply been waiting, patient as a spider in its web, for the right moment to reclaim him. In 68 hours he would learn whether love or justice mattered more, whether some sins were worth repeating to undo others. Early development. Marcus sat motionless in his chair until dawn painted the Memphis skyline gray, the shattered bourbon glass glittering like accusations around his feet. The photographs stared back at him. Child and woman, innocence and survival, everything lost and impossibly found. His phone remained silent on the side table, but he could feel the countdown pressing against his skull like a migraine. 67 hours and 31 minutes. He needed to think clearly, to find another way. There had to be options that didn't involve betraying Angela Torres all over again. By 7 a.m., he'd showered and dressed in his usual work clothes: khaki pants, navy polo with the Churchill Security Solutions logo embroidered over the breast pocket. Professional, unremarkable, the uniform of a man who'd spent 15 years becoming invisible. He swept up the glass fragments and headed downtown, driving his routine route along Union Avenue, as if normalcy could somehow insulate him from the chaos gathering around his life. His office occupied the second floor of a narrow building on South Main, accessible through a street-level entrance squeezed between vintage shops. The brass nameplate on his door, Churchill Security Solutions Private Investigations, had tarnished over the years, but he'd never replaced it. Tarnish suggested permanence, roots, the kind of established respectability that discouraged deeper scrutiny. The package waited on his desk like a cancer. Brown manila envelope, no return address, postmarked yesterday evening. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, though he knew what he'd find. The bracelet tumbled onto his desk blotter. 13 delicate dolphins linked by tarnished silver chain, each dolphin no bigger than his thumbnail, worn smooth by years of a child's fidgeting fingers. He'd bought it at a street fair in Detroit, watching Keisha's face light up when she spotted the marine life booth. She'd just turned 13 and had developed an obsession with ocean documentaries, dreaming of becoming a marine biologist despite living in a landlocked city where the Detroit River ran brown with industrial runoff. The bracelet had cost him $40 he couldn't really afford, but her joy had made it priceless. Now it felt like holding fragments of her childhood grave. A handwritten note accompanied the bracelet. FBI Memphis Field Office, 167 North Main Street. Case file 2007 MC 4419 in cold case vault, sub-basement level. 64 hours remaining. We'll know if you involve anyone else. Marcus stuffed both items into his desk drawer and locked it, muscle memory demanding he secure the evidence even as his mind reeled. 64 hours to penetrate federal security, steal his own case file, and somehow save a daughter he'd thought was dead. The impossibility of it threatened to paralyze him. His phone buzzed with a text from his only current client: security assessment for Midtown Medical Complex postponed until next week. Family emergency. Even his work was abandoning him. He tried calling old contacts, testing whether any bridges from his police days remained unburned. The responses told their own story. Marcus Churchill? Detective Sandra Mills had worked robbery during his Detroit years. Her voice carried 15 years of distance and wariness. Jesus, where did you— Never mind, I can't talk to you. Don't call this number again. Similar conversations played out through the morning, former colleagues who hung up immediately, others who listened just long enough to make their fear clear. Word had somehow spread through law enforcement networks that Marcus Churchill was radioactive again, that whatever protection his exile had provided was gone. By noon, he was drinking coffee and staring at the FBI building from a bench in Court Square Park. Federal security had evolved significantly since 2001. Metal detectors, armed guards, biometric scanners. The cold case vault would be in the most secure section, accessible only to authorized personnel with appropriate clearances. Breaking in would require resources, planning, and expertise he didn't possess. But the alternative was watching them kill Keisha for real this time. You look like hell, Marcus. He turned to find Special Agent Janet Ross standing behind his bench. She'd aged well, still carried herself with the coiled alertness of federal law enforcement, but gray threaded through her auburn hair and laugh lines softened her features. They'd worked together briefly during a joint task force operation in 2006, back when Marcus was still pretending to be an honest cop. Janet. He kept his voice neutral, wondering if this was coincidence or surveillance. Small world. Not that small. I work 2 blocks from here now. She gestured toward the federal building. Memphis white-collar crime unit. Mostly financial fraud. Some organized crime spillover from Detroit and Chicago. Her eyes studied his face with uncomfortable intensity. Heard you were running a security company. Keeping busy? The casual conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Janet Ross was asking questions, but her body language suggested she already knew the answers. Federal agents didn't make coincidental contact with former cops who'd fled under suspicious circumstances. Busy enough. Marcus stood, recognizing the futility of his morning's reconnaissance. Good seeing you, Janet. Marcus. Her voice stopped him before he'd taken 3 steps. When he turned back, her expression had shifted from casual to concerned. Be careful who you trust these days. There are people asking questions about old Detroit cases. People with long memories. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone with the growing certainty that his careful exile was collapsing from multiple directions. The Black Mafia wanted him to steal federal evidence. The FBI was already watching him. His daughter's life hung in the balance while forces beyond his control maneuvered for advantages he couldn't see. Marcus returned to his office and sat staring at the dolphins until the autumn light failed outside his windows, understanding finally that there was no safe path forward, only degrees of betrayal and the question of which one he could live with. Middle development. The whiskey bottle appeared on Marcus's desk at 8 p.m., like an old enemy offering false comfort. He hadn't bought it, hadn't even remembered owning it, but there it sat, Jameson, 3/4 full, the seal broken years ago during another crisis he'd tried to forget. The amber liquid caught the lamplight and threw golden shadows across the photographs of his daughter, creating the illusion that both versions of Keisha were watching him with disappointed eyes. He poured 2 fingers and stared at his reflection in the office window, seeing a stranger wearing his face. 15 years of careful sobriety, of controlled routine, of pretending the past couldn't reach him. All of it crumbling because he'd been stupid enough to believe geography could outrun guilt. The first sip burned like confession. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Check your email. The message contained a single video file, no subject line. Marcus's finger hovered over the attachment, knowing that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But Keisha's face in those photographs demanded he witness whatever truth they were offering. The video was grainy, shot through what looked like a security camera mounted high in a corner. Timestamp showed yesterday, 11:47 p.m. The location appeared to be some kind of warehouse space. Concrete floors, exposed ceiling, industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows. Then she walked into frame, and Marcus's world shifted off its axis. Keisha. Not the 13-year-old child from his memories, not even the young woman from the photograph. This was his daughter at 28, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that survival meant never showing weakness. She wore dark jeans and a black sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that emphasized the sharp angles her face had developed over the years of captivity. She was arguing with someone off camera, her voice barely audible through the video's poor audio quality. But Marcus could read her body language, the way she held her shoulders, the slight forward lean when she was angry. Gestures he'd watched develop through her childhood, before the night that changed everything. "You promised me this would end," she was saying, her words becoming clearer as she moved closer to the camera. "You promised if I helped you with the Memphis operation, you'd let me go." A man's voice responded, too low to make out the words, but Keisha's reaction was immediate and devastating. "No." Her voice cracked with 15 years of accumulated pain. "You can't keep using him. He doesn't even know I'm alive. This isn't protection anymore. It's torture." The camera angle shifted slightly, revealing more of the room. Marcus saw boxes stacked along the walls, equipment covered with tarps, the infrastructure of an operation that had been running for years. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, another figure watching the conversation. The video ended abruptly, leaving Marcus staring at his laptop screen with tears streaming down his face. His daughter was alive, had been alive this entire time, and she'd been working with the Black Mafia not as a captive, but as a willing participant trying to protect him from consequences he couldn't even see. The whiskey glass was empty. He couldn't remember finishing it. Another text arrived, she volunteered. "Marcus, 15 years ago, when we came for you, she offered herself instead. Said she'd work for us, help us expand into new territories, keep us informed about federal investigations. All so Daddy could live his quiet little life in Memphis." The room spun slightly as Marcus tried to process the implications. Keisha hadn't been kidnapped. She'd sacrificed herself, made a deal to save his life, then spent 15 years in the shadow world while he mourned her death and rebuilt his existence around guilt and grief. His phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call from the same unknown number. "Hello, Daddy?" Her voice was exactly as he'd imagined it would sound, his little girl grown up, but carrying wounds that would never fully heal. The word Daddy hung between them like a bridge across 15 years of silence. "Keisha." His voice broke saying her name. "Baby girl, I thought, we buried." "You buried an empty coffin. I watched from a car across the street." Her tone was carefully controlled, but he could hear the child underneath. "I wanted to run to you so many times, wanted to call to let you know I was okay. But they explained what would happen if you knew the truth. What would happen? You'd try to save me, and they'd have to kill us both." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. "I've been protecting you this whole time, Daddy, but now something's changed. The FBI knows about the Memphis operation. They're closing in on all of us." Marcus closed his eyes, understanding finally why the Black Mafia needed that case file destroyed. It wasn't just about his corruption. It was about 15 years of organized crime activity that Keisha had helped facilitate, thinking she was saving his life. "The file they want you to steal," she continued, "it's not just about you anymore. It's about me too, about everything I've done for them." The whiskey bottle was half empty now. When had he poured the third glass? "I'm going to get you out of this," he said. "No." Her voice hardened with an authority that reminded him painfully of her mother. "You're going to steal that file, and then you're going to disappear again. Because if you don't, they're going to kill both of us. And this time, they'll make sure you watch." The line went dead, leaving Marcus clutching the phone like a lifeline to a daughter who just told him to abandon her again. He set it down with trembling hands and reached for the whiskey, but stopped when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The bottle was sitting on top of a manila folder that hadn't been there before. His office door was locked. The security system showed no breaches. Yet someone had been inside, close enough to touch his desk. to watch him break apart while listening to Keisha's voice. The folder contained copies of documents he'd never seen, FBI surveillance reports dating back to his Detroit days, financial records tracking payments he'd forgotten making, and photographs of meetings he barely remembered. But it was the final document that made him understand how completely he'd been played. A psychological evaluation dated 3 months after Keisha's supposed death, conducted by Dr. Sarah Martinez, FBI behavioral analyst. The subject line read, "Assessment of subject's ongoing usefulness for intelligence gathering operations." Marcus read his own psychological profile with growing horror. The FBI had evaluated his grief, his guilt, his desperate need to believe his daughter's death meant something. They'd concluded he would be highly susceptible to manipulation through emotional triggers and unlikely to question narratives that confirm his existing trauma responses. They'd been studying him, not investigating, studying, like a lab rat in a maze. The phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a local Memphis number he recognized. "Mr. Churchill? This is Detective Williams, Memphis PD. We need to talk." "About what?" "About the break-in at Elmwood Cemetery last night. Security cameras caught someone digging up grave 247A. "That's your daughter's plot, sir." Marcus closed his eyes, finally understanding the full scope of their psychological warfare. "Was anything taken?" "Hard to say. The grave was already empty, Mr. Churchill. Has been for years, from the looks of it. We're going to need you to come down to the station and explain why you've been visiting an empty grave for 15 years. The whiskey glass shattered against the wall before Marcus realized he'd thrown it. Amber liquid streaked down the paint like tears, and the smell of alcohol filled the small office with phantom memories of his father's rage, his own failures, every moment when liquor had promised answers and delivered only deeper holes to fall into. But through the haze of betrayal and grief, one terrible truth crystallized. Keisha had lied to him. Not about being alive, that part was real, he could feel it in his bones the way a parent knows their child's heartbeat. But about the rest, about being a victim, about sacrificing herself to save him. The video they'd sent showed her arguing with her handlers, yes, but it also showed her walking freely, speaking with authority, moving like someone who belonged in that room. And her voice on the phone, careful, controlled, but not frightened. Not the voice of a captive, the voice of a collaborator. Marcus pulled up the psychological evaluation again, focusing on a section he'd skimmed the first time. Subject's daughter demonstrated above-average intelligence and manipulative tendencies during pre-incident interviews. In the unlikely event of her survival, recommend extreme caution regarding her motivations. Pre-incident interviews. They'd talked to Keisha before the shooting, before her supposed death. His hands shook as he accessed his security company's database and pulled up the facial recognition software he used for background checks. The program was expensive, powerful enough to scan social media, public records, surveillance footage from across multiple cities. He uploaded the clearest frame from the warehouse video and ran a search for the past 5 years. The results appeared in 30 seconds. Keisha Churchill, or the woman calling herself that, had been photographed at upscale restaurants in Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta. Always with different men, always dressed expensively, always looking comfortable and confident, never looking like a prisoner. One photograph stopped his breath completely. Keisha at what appeared to be a charity gala in Detroit 6 months ago. She was wearing a black evening gown and laughing at something her companion was saying. But it wasn't her appearance that shattered him, it was the date stamp. 6 months ago was when his security business had started getting unusual inquiries, when potential clients had begun asking detailed questions about his background, his time in Detroit, his family history, when someone had started testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. Keisha hadn't been protecting him from the Black Mafia. She'd been working with them to study him, to map his psychology and vulnerabilities. The grief-stricken father visiting his daughter's empty grave was the perfect mark for emotional manipulation. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. The bracelet hadn't come from a desecrated grave, it had come from Keisha herself, who'd kept it all these years as a prop for exactly this moment. The FBI case file they wanted him to steal probably contained evidence of her operations, not just his old corruption, and her phone call tonight hadn't been a daughter reaching out to her father. It had been a criminal giving her Mark final instructions. Marcus laughed, a broken sound in the empty office. They thought they knew him. Thought 15 years of guilt had made him weak, predictable, easy to control. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Marcus sat in the wreckage of his shattered beliefs, staring at the photograph of Keisha at the charity gala until the pixels burned into his retinas. The woman in the black evening gown bore his daughter's face, but everything else, the confident posture, the predatory smile, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to power, belonged to a stranger. He closed the laptop and reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he'd hoped never to use again. Tommy Castellano had run books for the Torino family before testifying his way into witness protection. If anyone understood the psychology of long-term criminal operations, it would be Tommy. Jesus Christ, Marcus. You know what time it is? I need advice, Tommy. About manipulation, about how they groom Marks for long-term cons. A pause. Tommy's breathing changed, became more alert. You in trouble? I'm the trouble. Someone's been running a 15-year psychological operation on me, using my dead daughter as bait. Marcus's voice cracked on the words. Except she's not dead. Shit. Marcus, listen to me very carefully. If they've been working you that long, they own every reaction you're having right now. Every move you think is rebellion, they've already planned for. You need to get out. Tonight. I can't. They don't have shit. Whatever they're claiming to hold over you, it's an illusion. The daughter you think you're saving? She's not your little girl anymore. She's them. Marcus ended the call and walked to his office safe, spinning the combination with muscle memory. Inside, beneath insurance papers and cash reserves, lay the artifacts of his former life, his service weapon, his detective shield, and a burner phone loaded with contacts from the Detroit underworld. Numbers he'd sworn never to use again. The gun felt heavier than he remembered. His regular phone buzzed with another text from Keisha's number, FBI building, service entrance, 3 a.m. Janitor's uniform in the blue Honda, parking level B2, key card taped under rear bumper. You have 40 minutes once you're inside. Marcus typed his response carefully. I know. Then he added, tell me something only my daughter would know. The reply came instantly. You used to sing Sweet Caroline when I couldn't sleep. Said it was Mom's favorite song, but I found out years later you made that up because you couldn't remember what she actually liked. His finger hovered over the keypad. The detail was accurate. A memory from when Keisha was 7, terrified of thunderstorms. But anyone who'd spent 15 years studying him could have extracted that information, could have learned his patterns, his stories, his weaknesses. Wrong answer, he typed back. Because his real daughter would have known the truth, he'd sung Sweet Caroline because it was the only song he could remember all the words to, and the real Keisha had called him out on it when she was 10, laughing at his terrible voice but making him promise to keep singing anyway. The woman pretending to be his daughter had given him the sanitized version of the memory, the version that made him look like a loving father instead of a man desperately improvising his way through parenthood. Marcus pocketed the burner phone and his service weapon, then opened his desk drawer and removed the bottle of pills Dr. Morrison had prescribed for anxiety. He'd never taken them, but he'd held onto them like insurance against the day his carefully constructed stability failed. Today seemed like that day. He dry swallowed 3 pills and waited for the chemical calm to settle over his nervous system. Then he called Agent Janet Ross. Marcus, it's after midnight. I know what they want me to steal from your building tonight, and I know why. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. How badly does the FBI want the Memphis Black Mafia operation? A long pause. Where are you? My office. And Janet, the woman calling herself my daughter? Run her prints against the federal database. Real name's probably something else entirely. Marcus, don't do anything stupid. Too late for that. I've been doing stupid things for 15 years. He looked around his office one last time. At the dolphin photographs, at the whiskey stain on the wall, at the empty picture frame where he'd kept Keisha's school photo until tonight. But I'm done being the mark in someone else's con. He hung up and walked to his window, watching the Memphis skyline glitter in the darkness. Somewhere out there, the woman wearing his daughter's face was waiting for him to break into a federal building, waiting for him to complete whatever endgame they'd spent 15 years orchestrating. Instead, Marcus Churchill was going to introduce them to the corrupt cop they thought they'd buried. The man who'd learned to survive in Detroit by being more ruthless than his enemies expected. They'd studied his grief and guilt and trauma. They'd forgotten to study his rage. Climax. The federal building's parking garage was a tomb of concrete and shadow at 2:47 a.m. Marcus found the blue Honda exactly where they'd promised, the janitor's uniform hanging in the back seat like a costume for some macabre theater. But instead of changing clothes, he sat in his own car and made one final call on the burner phone. The number belonged to Vincent D'Angelo, the only man from his Detroit days who'd never asked for favors, never called in debts. Vincent had run clean operations in a dirty city, and more importantly, he understood loyalty. Marcus Churchill, thought you were dead. Close enough. I need to know about a woman, mid-20s, might be using the name Keisha Churchill. She's been running operations for the Black Mafia for at least 5 years. Silence stretched between them like a bridge across 15 years of buried history. When Vincent spoke again, his voice carried the weight of bad news. Talia Morrison. Real smart, real dangerous. Word is she volunteered for deep cover work when she was just a kid. Some kind of family protection deal that went sideways. A pause. Marcus, if she's calling herself your daughter, you need to understand she's not playing a role anymore. She became it. The phone slipped from Marcus's numb fingers. Talia Morrison. Not Keisha Churchill, but someone who'd inhabited his daughter's identity so completely that she'd convinced herself it was real. 15 years of living someone else's life, becoming someone else's ghost. He picked up the phone with shaking hands. Vincent, I need you to do something for me. In exactly 30 minutes, call Agent Janet Ross at the Memphis FBI field office. Tell her Marcus Churchill is inside their building, but he's not there to steal anything. He's there to deliver everything. Marcus ended the call and walked to the building's service entrance, his movements steady despite the chemical calm of the pills and the chaos raging in his mind. The keycard worked exactly as promised, and the janitor's uniform fit perfectly, details that would have comforted the grieving father they'd expected to control. But Marcus Churchill wasn't here to be controlled anymore. The FBI's cold case vault was on the 3rd floor, behind 2 more secured doors and a motion sensor system that had been disabled from the inside, more evidence of how thoroughly they'd compromised the investigation. Marcus found the case file exactly where their intelligence had indicated, but instead of stealing it, he sat down in the vault's sterile fluorescent lighting and began to read. The truth was worse than anything he'd imagined. Keisha Churchill had died 15 years ago, exactly as he'd always believed. The drive-by shooting in Detroit had been real, brutal, final. But Talia Morrison, a 13-year-old girl whose father owed money to the same Black Mafia family, had witnessed the murder from across the street. When Marcus began visiting Keisha's grave, lost in grief and guilt, Talia had started watching him, studying him, learning to become the daughter he'd lost. The psychological manipulation hadn't been orchestrated by criminal masterminds. It had been the desperate improvisation of a traumatized child who'd found a broken man and convinced herself she could fix him by becoming his ghost. But trauma and intelligence were a dangerous combination. Over 15 years, Talia had evolved from a frightened girl playing dress-up in a dead child's identity to a criminal operator who genuinely believed she was protecting the father she'd chosen. The Black Mafia hadn't recruited her, she'd recruited them, using Marcus's grief as leverage to build her own power base. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Marcus closed the file and waited, his service weapon resting on the table beside the evidence of 15 years of mutual deception. Agent Janet Ross appeared in the doorway with 2 other agents, their weapons drawn but not aimed. Her face showed relief mixed with professional wariness. Marcus, we got your message through Vincent D'Angelo. Are you here to cooperate? I'm here to end this. He gestured to the open file. But first, I need to know, is she coming? Ross checked her watch. Our surveillance teams report movement at 3 Black Mafia locations. Someone calling herself Keisha Churchill just walked into our field office demanding to negotiate for your release. Marcus nodded, understanding finally that the woman who'd called herself his daughter had been just as trapped as he was. caught between the child she'd been and the identity she'd stolen, between protecting him and destroying herself. "Then let's go have a conversation with my daughter," he said, standing slowly with his hands visible. "It's time we both learned who we really are." The vault's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 3 federal agents and 1 broken man walked toward a truth that would shatter 2 lives built on the foundation of 1 girl's grave. The FBI field office conference room felt smaller than Marcus had expected, its beige walls closing in like the interrogation rooms he remembered from Detroit. But this wasn't an interrogation, it was something closer to an exorcism. Talia Morrison sat across from him, still calling herself Keisha, her hands folded on the metal table between them. Without the shadows and camera angles of the warehouse video, he could see the truth more clearly. She had his daughter's eyes, but they belonged to a stranger's face. 15 years of living someone else's life had carved unfamiliar lines around her mouth, left her with gestures that were learned rather than inherited. "You read the file," she said. It wasn't a question. "All of it." Marcus kept his voice steady, professional, including the part about how a 13-year-old girl convinced herself she could resurrect the dead. Agent Ross sat at the far end of the table, taking notes but staying silent. They'd agreed to let this conversation play out. 2 damaged people trying to find their way back from a shared delusion that had consumed half their lives. "I saved you," Talia said, and for the first time, her voice cracked. "When I found you at that grave, you were dying, drinking yourself to death, talking to an empty headstone. I gave you a reason to live. You gave me a lie. I gave you hope." Marcus studied her face, searching for traces of the 13-year-old girl who'd watched his real daughter die. "What happened to your father? The man who owed the Black Mafia money?" Talia's composure flickered. "They killed him 3 days after Keisha died. I was hiding in our apartment when they came. I heard everything." She looked down at her hands. "I couldn't save him, but I thought maybe I could save you." The tragedy of it settled over the room like dust. 2 orphans who'd found each other in the wreckage of violence, each trying to heal wounds that couldn't be healed. Marcus felt his anger dissolving into something deeper and more painful. Grief for the childhood she'd sacrificed, for the daughter he'd truly lost, for the 15 years they'd both spent living in the shadow of a ghost. "The Black Mafia operations," Ross interjected gently. "We need names, locations, financial records." Talia reached into her jacket and placed a flash drive on the table. "Everything's there. Bank accounts, safe houses, the whole network. I've been documenting it all." She looked at Marcus. "I told myself it was insurance, in case they ever tried to hurt you. But really, I think I always knew this day would come." Marcus picked up the drive, weighing it in his palm. Such a small thing to contain the destruction of so many lives. What happens now? "Now you both learn how to live without the lie," Ross said. "Talia will enter witness protection. New identity, new life. And Marcus," she paused, "the corruption charges from Detroit have been dropped. Your cooperation here closes a lot of old cases." "I don't want witness protection," Talia said suddenly. "I want to testify, all of it, in open court." Marcus leaned forward. "That's a death sentence." "Maybe, but I'm tired of being someone else." She met his eyes directly for the first time. "And I'm tired of making you live with a ghost." The silence stretched between them until Marcus finally spoke. "My real daughter, Keisha. She would have been proud of what you tried to do, the intention, if not the method." "You think so?" "She always tried to fix broken things. Birds with hurt wings, kids at school who got picked on." His voice caught. "She would have tried to fix me too if she'd lived long enough." Talia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I wasn't trying to replace her. I know that now." Agent Ross gathered her notes and stood. "I'll give you a few more minutes." After she left, Marcus and Talia sat in the quiet hum of institutional air conditioning, 2 strangers who'd shared an impossible intimacy. Finally, Marcus reached across the table and touched her hand, not as a father to daughter, but as one survivor to another. "Thank you," he said, "for trying to save me. Thank you for letting me pretend I was someone worth saving." 6 months later, Marcus Churchill stood in Elmwood Cemetery beside his daughter's headstone. The grave had been properly restored, the earth settled back into peace. He placed fresh flowers, yellow roses, Keisha's favorites, and spoke to her in words meant for the living girl who'd died 15 years ago, not the ghost who'd haunted him since. The wind carried his voice across the Memphis morning, and for the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt like his daughter might actually be listening.